Hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of Cut Rate Commander, the series where we take a look at low-price commanders and make budget decks with them. My name is Grazzet, and today we'll be looking at a build featuring the joyful drowner of cities, Xolatoyac the Smiling Flood. But before we continue, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you like this content, and if you really like it, please consider supporting the channel directly either through Buy Me a Coffee or through our Game Nerds affiliate link in the description. Also, be sure to stick around until the end of the video to see which commanders we'll be covering next, and what commanders you'll be voting for an upcoming episode. So, with that out of the way, let's start by taking a look at the commander and playstyle. Xolatoyac the Smiling Flood is a 6/6 Salamander Serpent that costs 4 and Simic that has the following two abilities. Firstly, whenever they enter the battlefield or attack, we put a flood counter on target land, turning that land into an island in addition to its other types for as long as it has a flood counter on it. And secondly, at the beginning of our end step, we untap each permanent we control with a counter on it. Breaking down their core stats, Xolatoyac possesses a gigantic CMC, an average stat block for their cost, and a pair of counter-centric abilities that enable them to spread counters throughout the battlefield as they come down and swing in, and then get extra uses out of any permanents we control with counters on them. Taking a closer look at their second ability first, since it's arguably the more powerful of the two, it more or less allows Xolatoyac to function as a Seedborn Muse that we always have access to from our command zone, although admittedly with a few caveats. Firstly, and most obviously, Xolatoyac is limited to only untapping permanents with counters on them, requiring some setup to get the maximum use out of this untap effect when they come down, but when considering how prevalent counter distribution is in Simic, this limitation is one we can easily circumvent via our color combination's already superb ability to get counters onto our creatures, and, with a little creativity, can be enabled even further via permanents that come into play with counters out of the gate, and cards that let us get counters on permanents that would otherwise be unable to accumulate counters on their own. And then secondly, it is also limited to only untapping permanents on our end step, making it a lot less broken than other mass untappers that can untap permanents on every player's turn, but, like them, still makes our counter-laden creatures pseudo-vigilant so they can screen attacks for us after they swing in or tap themselves down to use their effects, nets us extra activations out of our permanents with tap effects to get more uses out of their abilities, and also lets us keep some of our mana open via untapping mana dorks, mana rocks, and even lands, even if we committed all that mana to casting spells on our turn so we can still interact with our opponents on theirs. This then synergizes nicely with Xolatoyac's first ability, which repeatedly allows us to get flood counters onto our lands, allowing them to benefit from our commanders untapping while they fix our mana better by giving us easy access to blue, or, alternatively, letting us turn our opponent's lands into islands instead to enable island walk for our creatures. Do keep in mind, however, since flood counters don't do anything on their own, these lands will no longer count as islands if Xolatoyac leaves play. So, as we can see based on their abilities, Xolatoyac is clearly a counter-focused commander, aiming to get counters on as many of our permanents as possible so we can get a free untap from them each turn. And, luckily for us, Simic has absolutely no shortage of effects that allow us to do just that in order to get the maximum value out of our commander, ranging from the more common single target and mass +1/+1 counter distributing effects to get counters onto our creatures, the bit less common selection of lands and artifacts that either come into play with their own counters or can generate counters onto themselves, and even a handful of rarer options that allow us to get counters on permanents that generally wouldn't be able to get them in the first place, so they can also benefit from our commander's ability. Then, with our counter distribution sorted, we'll be needing some cards that can take advantage of our free untap each turn. So we'll be running a decent selection of permanents with tap effects that, once we get counters on them, will be able to generate double the value for us per rotation. And finally, we'll be capping off this build with a suite of proliferation sources to get even more counters onto our permanents, and a handful of other mass untapping effects to work alongside our commander to get extra uses out of all our previously mentioned tap effects, enabling Xolatoyac to drown our opponents with value and empowered bodies while they smile down upon them with their cold, unfeeling eyes. Now, here is where I would normally give you some lore on the commander, but seeing as there is none on this guy as far as I could find, let's just take a moment to appreciate just how adorable this gigantic flood monster is. Look at his stupid happy face, look at it, and his hands, he's got so many grabbers! He's got no idea he's killing thousands of people, he's just happy to be here! Just a big derpy drown happy murder monster. 10 out of 10, no notes. Ahem. So, now that we know a bit more about the commander and playstyle, let's start looking at the deck itself by starting with the creatures. Opening with the counter-centric side of our game plan, seeing as it's critical in order for us to get the maximum number of permanents untapped via our commander each turn, we'll start off with a suite of creatures that can distribute counters to themselves or others. Beginning with the most common type of counter we'll be granting our creatures, those being +1/+1 counters, we'll start off by running our Windweaver of Hope and Master Biomancer as sources of +1/+1 counters that not only have other creatures ETB with counters on them, but also become better at doing so by pumping their toughness and power with counters respectively. Defiler of Vigor as a repeatable source of AoE counter distribution that procs whenever we cast green permanent spells, of which we have many, while also providing ramp for those spells via turning a green pip in their mana cost into a Phyrexian mana to let us pay life instead, and being an overstatted trampling beatstick to crack in with as well. And a Loyal Guardian as a passive source of AoE counter distribution each turn so long as we control our commander to consistently empower our board and enable our game plan. Then from there, as creatures who are more concerned about accumulating counters on themselves rather than others, we'll be adding Champion of Lambholt to our ranks, who grows itself with counters as our creatures ETB and then in turn makes our board evasive by preventing blocks from creatures that are smaller than it so we can pile on the damage. Chasm Skulker, which loads itself up with counters as we draw cards, and, if our opponents remove it, spawns a horde of island walking tokens equal to the number of +1/+1 counters it had that can take advantage of our ability to turn our opponent's lands into islands to reliably get in for damage while we continually grow them with our other +1/+1 counter sources. And lastly, Gyre Sage and Incubation Druid, both of which can load themselves up with counters via Evolve and Adapt respectively, and can then be used as potent mana dorks for us to use on both our and our opponent's turns as we untap them. Then, as creatures who can give their counters to others, we'll be slotting in Forgotten Ancient, which accumulates counters on itself as players cast spells, and then lets us distribute those counters to our creatures, thereby ensuring we can get the initial counters on our creatures to untap them, or stack counters on our beatsticks to make them even more dangerous, as well as the Graft creatures, Plaxcaster Frogling, and Sporeback Troll, both of whom can gift their counters to our creatures as they ETB, which only gets better alongside the proliferation sources we'll be covering later, and, on top of that, make use of our untapping lands and mana sources to protect our counter-laden creatures via the repeatable Shroud and Regeneration they provide respectively. Now, staying on the topic of creatures that care about +1/+1 counters on other creatures and or themselves, we'll also be running Rishkar Pima Renegade, who distributes counters as he ETBs, then turns all our creatures with counters into green mana dorks to generate us even more mana on both our and our opponent's turns. Danny Pink, who turns all our counter distribution into repeatable card advantage, and can still distribute +1/+1 counters himself as he swings in thanks to Mentor. Fathom Mage, which serves as another source of repeatable card advantage as it gains counters, which it can do quite easily between its own Evolve and our deck's counter distribution capabilities, and Herald of Secret Streams, which gives us another way to make the creatures we'll be buffing with counters evasive to ensure their increased stat blocks will still be able to reliably connect to our opponent's faces, even on the most clogged board states. Kami of Whispered Hopes then also finds a home in this slot, as both a card that empowers +1/+1 counter distribution by being a hardened scales on a body, and as a card that wants to accumulate counters via its mana generation that scales off of its power to power up our mana production even further. Then veering away from +1/+1 counters and onto creatures in our 99 that come into play or generate other types of counters, we'll of course have the Flood of Mars join our ranks, which gives us another repeatable source of flood counters for our lands so we can untap them with Xolatoyac, as well as another way to turn our opponent's lands into islands to enable its own and our other creatures' island walk, or alternatively, being usable as a way for us to turn our opponent's creatures into copies of itself to blank their effects if we need to. Arixmithy's Slumbering Isle, which initially serves as a land that taps for 2 and that we can get an additional untap out of each turn thanks to the slumber counters on it, that eventually turns into a massive 12/12 beatstick that we can crack in with and make even bigger with our counter distribution. And lastly, Enclave Cryptologist, which can load itself up with level counters to turn itself into a source of repeatable card selection, and eventually, straight up card advantage as we pump mana into it or multiply its counters through other ways. And speaking of multiplying counters, we'll also be running various sources of proliferation in this build to get even more counters on our creatures and other permanents after they gain their initial ones to make them even bigger and or to empower their effects, such as Thrumming Bird and Guild-Pact Informant, which proliferate on damage and can easily get in for damage thanks to their built-in evasion, which also makes them solid targets to load up with counters as well. Merfolk Skydiver, which is another evasive body that we can this time pump mana into via our untapping mana sources to proliferate instead. Evolution Sage, which repeatedly proliferates as we make our land drops. And Canker Bloom, which gives us the option to sack it away to proliferate, or, if we need to, we can use it to pop back row instead. Then, on the slightly more evil side of things, we'll also be including Bloated Contaminator, which also proliferates on damage but opts to crash through blockers instead with Trample, and, on top of that, also has Toxic 1, which is incredibly dangerous in this build for any opponent it connects with even once, thanks to this build's various number of counter-multiplying effects. Contaminated Grafter, which turns all our creatures into on-damage proliferators, is another toxic trampler to get the poison counter alternate win con running, and even serves as a payoff for the poison game plan via the ramp and draw it provides us with once a player has 3 or more of them on them to help generate us value. And a Tainted Observer, which is an evasive toxic 1 body and lets us proliferate by paying 2 whenever a creature we control ETBs to easily let us keep spreading our poison and multiplying our other types of counters. And as one final piece of counter multiplication, we'll also be including Vorel of the Hulklad in our ranks, who may not technically be a source of proliferation, but does let us repeatedly double the amount of counters we have on our creatures, artifacts, and or lands, to make all our counter-laden permanents even better, so we'll happily run him. Now, to close out our selection of creatures that use counters to generate counters, we'll be including 2 somewhat unique entrants to the build that can help us get counters on permanents that otherwise would be unable to get them. Those being Aven Courier, who, on attack, can grant any permanent we control a counter which we have on any other permanent so long as it doesn't already have that kind of counter, making it a superb way to get counters on permanents that are usually harder to get counters on, such as our lands and artifacts, so they can benefit from our commander's untapping, and Goldberry River Daughter, who lets us move counters from one permanent to another with her tap effect to again get counters on permanents we would otherwise have trouble with, generating us card advantage as she does so, and, thanks to this build's untap effects, can do so much faster than usual. So, having covered our multitude of counter-generating and distributing creatures and payoffs for them, let's take a moment to go over some of the non-counter-centric creatures with tap effects we'll be including in the build, to take advantage of the free untap Xolatoyac provides them with after we get counters onto them, such as Archivist and Tawashi Guidebot, both of which let us tap them to generate repeatable card advantage, the former always doing so for free, and the latter usually doing so for free thanks to all the modified creatures we'll have in play. Zamone Quandrix Prodigy, who serves as both a repeatable source of ramp via the extra lands she gets into play for us, as well as another source of repeatable card advantage that we can pump mana into from our untapped lands and mana sources to keep our hands topped off. and Arcanus the Omnipotent, who draws us a whopping 3 cards every time we tap him and can almost completely reload our hands from empty each rotation once we get a counter on him, and that's on top of letting us use our open mana to protect him from removal by bouncing him back to our hand if we need to. Then, as an additional +1/+1 counter distribution source to close out our tap effect creature lineup, we have Experiment Kraj, which I didn't include among the other +1/+1 counter distributing creatures, despite being able to do so with its tap effect at no mana cost, since we'll be primarily running it as a means for us to net ourselves a second copy of all our other creatures' tap effects with its passive ability, giving us access to more ramp, more draw, and more utility from all the other creatures that we've covered so far. Then, as we approach the end of our creature base, we'll be adding in a pair of creatures that care about Xolatoyac's ability to turn lands into islands in order to make themselves more powerful, those being Cold-Eyed Selkie, whose built-in island walk and draw that scales off damage dealt pairs fantastically with our commander's ability to turn any of our opponent's lands into islands to reliably get in for damage and draw us cards off of any target, which only gets better as we make it bigger with counters, and a Scourge of Fleets, which instead takes advantage of us turning our own lands into islands, which we'll be doing more often anyway to get extra untaps out of them, so we can use it as a powerful one-sided wipe that scales off the number of islands we have in play to let us reliably retake control of the board despite not being a mono blue deck. And then to conclude our creature entries, we'll be running both the 13th Doctor and a Mercfiend Liege as ways for us to get even more untaps for our creatures, with the former letting us get 1 additional untap from our creatures with +1/+1 counters on them to work alongside our commander, and the latter netting us extra untaps off of all our colored creatures on each player's untap step for even more value, while being a Simic Lord on top of that to help boost our creature stats alongside the counters on them. That covers all our creatures, so let's move on to our instance. As the only 2 direct +1/+1 counter support cards will be running in this category, we have Inspiring Call, which is pulling double duty in this build as both another way to protect all our creatures with +1/+1 counters on them from removal via making them indestructible, and as a way for us to draw a card for each of them as well, allowing us to ride out most wipes and reloading our hands in the process, and a Silk Guard, which also improves our counter-laden creatures' durability, this time by protecting them from targeted removal via granting them all hexproof for a single mana, and, if we have the mana to pump into it, we can also use it to get even more counters on our creatures to continue fueling our primary game plan. Then from there, it's going to be removal all the way down for the remainder of this category to help us pick apart our opponent's boards and or disrupt our opponent's spells, with Reality Shift, Resculpt, and Beast Within helping us with the former at the cost of giving our opponents a vanilla creature, which our bigger, counter-empowered creatures should have no issue running over, and Counterspell, Arcane Denial, and Negate lending a hand with the latter, as they're all cheap and efficient counterspells to help us hamper our opponent's key plays, or just help to keep our boards intact against removal and wipes. And then to round out this category, we'll be running one last counterspell in the form of Reject Imperfection, which is a bit less efficient than the other counterspells we'll be running, but makes up for its increased cost by proliferating if it counters a CMC 3 or less spell, making it superb at countering common targeted removal spells against our key creatures and then multiplying our counters as a bonus. That covers all our instants, so let's move on to our sorceries. As the only member of our sorcery category, we have Wave Goodbye, which earns a spot in this build by being another one-sided board wipe that dodges all creatures with +1/+1 counters on them while bouncing all other creatures back to hand, generally leaving our boards untouched while it clears away our opponents so that our counter-laden creatures can swing in unimpeded with their buffed-up stat blocks. That covers our lone sorcery, so let's move on to our enchantments. Our enchantment category this time around will be consisting entirely of +1/+1 centric cards, focused around getting +1/+1 counters onto our creatures directly or empowering our means to do so. Starting in the first camp, we'll be running both Fight Rigging and Hadana's Climb, each of which passively grant a creature a +1/+1 counter each turn to get our commander's untapped game plan rolling and to enable our counter-centric payoffs, while also providing us with additional utility. With the first also netting us a free spell off its hideaway once a creature gets big enough for added value, and the second eventually turning into a mana sink we can use to make our already big creatures even bigger and evasive, so they can crack in even harder and more reliably. Simic Ascendancy will then also be joining us in this slot, as both a source of +1/+1 counters we can pump mana into at instant speed, making it an ideal way to spend any unspent mana we still have from our untapped mana sources before the turn gets back to us, as well as being a +1/+1 counter payoff via its alternate win condition as we get counters onto our creatures, which we can theoretically meet the requirements for the turn it comes down with enough creatures and proliferation sources in play to give our opponents only a single turn to deal with it before we win. And lastly, as a pure +1/+1 counter support piece, we have Hardened Scales, which just makes all our +1/+1 counter generating and multiplying effects even better via the additional +1/+1 counter it tacks on to grow all our creatures at, generally, double the rate. That covers all our enchantments, so let's move on to our artifacts. Starting off this category with the counter-centric artifacts we'll be slotting into our build, we'll be running Ozolith the Shattered Spire as another Hardened Scales-like effect to net our creatures extra +1/+1 counters as we load them up, which also lets us put +1/+1 counters onto our creatures with its tap effect so it can enable itself as well as the rest of our game plan, and Eril Narsil Reforged as a piece of equipment that can repeatedly distribute counters to our entire board as the equipped creature swings in, which becomes even better alongside our wide boards and our multiple ways to keep our boards intact, and Contagion Clasp as a proliferation source on a tap effect that, if we can engineer a way to get a counter on it, we can use multiple times per rotation to keep growing our counters. Then moving on to the handful of mana rocks in this build that can grant themselves counters to take advantage of our commander's untap effect to be used more often, we have Everflowing Chalice and Astral Cornucopia, both of which are scalable mana rocks that come into play with charge counters that we can later make even better as we proliferate the counters on them, and Replicating Ring, which puts a night counter on itself after a single rotation to untap itself every turn after that, and, once again, thanks to our sources of Proliferate, we can drastically increase the rate at which it acquires night counters to eventually net us 8 more mana rocks. Then pivoting from counter-focused ramp and onto counter-focused removal, we'll be adding Lux Cannon to our artifact arsenal, which can take advantage of our untap effects and our counter multipliers to destroy at least 1 permanent per rotation once we get our game plan rolling. Then, to close out our artifacts, we'll be running Soul Ring and Arcane Signet as some more traditional sources of mana acceleration, which can still fit into our primary game plan via getting counters onto them to help speed up our mana bases even further. That covers all our artifacts, so let's move on to our Planeswalkers. As the singular Planeswalker entry we'll be running in this build, we have Jiang Yangu Wildcrafter, who, despite lacking an ultimate, still fits very nicely into this build as a repeatable source of +1/+1 counters we can get additional uses out of via Proliferate, and as a way for us to passively turn all our +1/+1 counter-empowered creatures into mana dorks to give us even more untappable sources of mana to work alongside our commander. That covers our lone Planeswalker, so let's move on to our land base. Quickly going over the lands we'll be running exclusively because they either come in with counters or can put counters on themselves to be untapped with our commander. We have Vivid Creek and Vivid Grove, both of which come into play with 2 charge counters we can use to fix our mana if we need to. Blast Zone, which also comes into play with a charge counter and we can crack to use as permanent removal as needed. Trenzalore Clock Tower, which puts a time counter on itself as soon as we tap it, and whose Time Twister-like effect to reload our hand and deck can be used in this build thanks to the inclusion of the 13th Doctor. Llanowar Reborn, which comes into play with a +1/+1 counter on it thanks to Graft, and makes superb use of our proliferation sources to get more counters on itself and then spread those counters to our creatures as they ETB. And the Monumental Facade, which ETBs with 2 oil counters on it and lets us put those oil counters on our artifacts or creatures, which we'll mainly be using on our mana rocks that can't put counters on themselves so we can untap them with Xolatoyac's effect. Then, as some more traditional mana lands, we'll be running Command Tower, Dreamroot Cascade, Hinterland Harbor, Vineglimmer Snarl, Waterlogged Grove, and Yavimaya Coast, as dual lands that either usually or always come into play untapped, so they can provide us with reliable access to our colors without having to sacrifice speed to do so, as well as Myriad Landscape to give us one last bit of ramp and fixing from our land slot to help improve our mana base's consistency. Then, as our utility lands, we'll of course be slotting in Karn's Bastion as a proliferation source from our land slot to help fuel our counter-centric game plan, alongside Alchemist's Refuge, which may not directly support our game plan, but whose ability to let us cast any of our spells at flash speed makes superb use of all the mana sources and lands we'll be untapping, so we can use it to cast our spells if we don't have abilities to pump that mana into. And finally, we'll be running 10 islands and 11 forests as our basics to close out our land base. So, now that we've covered all the cards in the deck, let's take a look at this deck's breakdown. This deck currently has 40 creatures including our commander, 9 instants, 1 sorcery, 4 enchantments, 9 artifacts, 1 planeswalker, and 36 lands. Looking at the stats that matter to our game plan, we have 25 sources of +1/+1 counters for themselves or others, 18 cards that care about +1/+1 counters, 13 sources of non-+1/+1 counters for themselves or others, 17 cards that care about any type of counter, 13 ways to proliferate or otherwise multiply or move counters, 20 non-land permanents with tap effects, 3 sources of mass untapping for our creatures and or permanents, and 4 cards that care about islands, leaving us with a primarily +1/+1 counter-focused build that still manages to benefit from every aspect our commander brings to the table, between easily getting counters on our permanents to be untapped, including various permanents with tap effects that we can get extra uses of as they untap, and even a handful of cards that care about us changing our or our opponent's lands into islands. For general deck stats, we have 15 ramp sources, 12 card draw sources, 11 targeted removal sources, and 2 board wipes, giving us a pretty standard array of core stats with no substantial outliers. Then looking at our mana curve, we have 2 0-drops, 4 1-drops, 18 2-drops, 20 3-drops, 12 4-drops, 4 5-drops, 3 6-drops, and 1 7-drop. Leaving us with a mid-weight curve that aims to get our counter-generating and distributing permanents into play quickly, followed by permanents with tap effects that we can get counters on while we ramp up to cast our commander. Then, once Xolatoyac comes down, it's just a matter of generating more and more value off of our tap effects while we load up our creatures with more counters, ideally while keeping our board intact with our counter spells and sources of protection, until eventually our flood of value and counter-laden creatures simply sweep away our opponents. Currently, this deck is valued at $65.35, not counting the price of basic lands or shipping. This price was calculated by using the cheapest listed marketplace price on TCG Player at the time of this recording. For side grades, if we'd rather focus more on the counter distribution side of our build rather than untapping our creatures, we can consider replacing Archivist and Tawashi Guidebot with Bread for the Hunt and Primal Empathy as more counter-centric sources of card advantage, or, if we want to take it in the opposite direction, we can instead replace Reject Imperfection with Deepwood Denizen as another tap source of draw that still plays into our counter-centric playstyle. Then, for upgrades, we can trade out Reject Imperfection in favor of Ripples of Potential, which serves as a way for us to protect our entire board of modified permanents from removal by phasing them out, and still proliferates on top of that to net us more counters on them. The Monumental Facade can be terraformed into Nesting Grounds, providing us with another way to transfer counters from one permanent to another to enable untapping for most of our deck. Fight Rigging can be replaced with Court of Garenbrig, which serves as another source of +1/+1 counters initially that also makes us the Monarch on top of that for added card advantage, and, if we can hold on to the crown for a full rotation, doubles the amount of +1/+1 counters we have on our creatures instead to exponentially grow them each turn. And we can scrap Contagion Clasp to make room for the Ozolith, which provides a powerful safety net that lets us stockpile our counters onto it as our creatures die so we can put them right back onto new bodies, thereby ensuring that the time and effort spent accumulating those counters didn't go to waste. And finally, because we're in the colors we're in, and of course, we need a busted, high-price counter-centric artifact with a tap effect that generates card advantage for us, we'll be slotting out Archivist for, you guessed it, the One Ring. Ha! Not this time, Great Henge. Cause the One Ring actually fits better in this build since it can put burden counters on itself so it can benefit from our commander's untapping, and we can get even more burden counters on it via our proliferate effects to consistently reload our hands with it each turn. But seriously though, the Great Henge would still be great here since it still loads up our creatures with +1/+1 counters, generates card advantage as they come down, etc, etc, but it's had it too good for too long, so screw it. Thanks everyone for sticking around until the end of the video. Firstly, before we continue, I'd like to take a moment to thank all of the channel subscribers for having helped the channel reach its 16.6k subscriber milestone. It's all thanks to your continued support that this channel keeps growing, so sincerely, thank you. Now, with Xolatoyac covered, the next commander builds we'll be covering will be the life-gaining board wipe Amalia Benavides Aguirre, followed by last week's poll winner, the Descend-focused fungus, the Myco Tyrant. So look forward to those two builds coming soon. Then, as our new poll contestants for this week, we'll be giving some of the newly awakened gods from the plane their chance at a build of their own, with this week's contenders being the spell-slinging rebounder Ogier Paktek Deepest Epoch, the hand-attacking Aklazot's Deepest Betrayal, and a creature and land summoning Ogier Kaslam Deepest Growth. So please cast your votes in the community tab, link in the description, and let me know in the comments who you voted for and which commanders you want to see me feature in future polls. And lastly, before we close out, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you haven't done so already, as this channel can't continue to grow without your support. And if you're feeling particularly generous, feel free to keep me caffeinated via buying me a coffee at the link in the description, or alternatively, use our Game Nerds affiliate link in the description if you're looking to purchase sealed MTG product, accessories, board games, or any of their other wide selection of products at low prices that include free shipping for orders over $75, and a rewards program that builds up store credit over time as you make your purchases. And if any of you would like to support the channel in a different way, feel free to check out the other deck techs floating around my head if you'd like to see the latest builds, or click on the link above for a playlist of all the cut-rate Commander episodes I've made so far. And with that, have a good one folks, and stay safe.